Begin tape. Leaving Dead Space 3, 2, 1. If you're hearing this tape, it means we have finally made it to the end, kind of the Scott Cawthon era FNaF. While there is still technically one more game after this one, the true, important ending to all that came before lies in this game. The finale in itself being done in a masterful way. But how we got here, what it all means, and more begin in 3,
2, 1.
After the resounding success of FNaF's sister location, the future looked bright for the franchise as a whole. For the first time ever, we were given a direct setup to a following game at the end of Sister Location's custom night. That in itself got people excited for whatever Scott was going to make next. In the meantime, Scott made a post on Steam telling us that supposedly one singular retcon has been made as of Sister Location. But it didn't seem to cause any trouble in the community, so he didn't say what it was. Specifically, I feel a responsibility to mention this because my last two videos stated that there was in fact a huge retcon between 4 and Sister Location, and I know some may say this debunks that idea. My counter though is I feel Scott's definition of what constitutes a retcon doesn't include the changing of intentions between concurrent releases of games. I know that's the dictionary definition, but just bear with me. I feel that what he sees as a retcon is when a piece of information is presented in one game, supported by a following game, and then changed later on. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what this could be, and the conclusion I've come to is that the retcon is Golden Freddy's role in the games. I feel in the first couple of games the implication was that the killer's costume of choice was Golden Freddy, which is why in the Give Gifts, Give Life minigame, we see that although the 5th child was never properly bound to a costume, it still manifests itself as Golden Freddy, perhaps because that was the last thing it saw. Starting in 3 though, it's shown that the killer's actual suit was Spring Bonnie, and going forward with the series, it's implied that the 5th child was actually stuffed into Golden Freddy after all. You'll find that this fact of the Golden Freddy suit being real at one point becomes an important aspect of this game, and maybe even the next. Carrying on, around this time, Scott released a new image on the FNaF World website which seemed to show some version of Baby, with her eyes staring directly into the camera. People noticed in the source codes between FNaF World and Scott Games, an argument of some kind was going on, presumably between Baby and the rest of Ennard. It's written in a way that kind of looks as if the other Funtime animatronics have had enough of Baby and want to get rid of her. Unfortunately, this was soon followed by a Steam post from Scott saying that he's decided to cancel FNaF 6, and in its place he wanted to work on a free, more lighthearted Tycoon-style game, and alongside this post, Baby's eyes on the FNaF World website were closed. And with that, ushered in almost half a year of total silence from Scott. We got some things in the meantime worth mentioning though. In the book The Freddy Files, the last page shows an image of what looks to be Baby, now equipped with a lobster claw, standing by a poster that says Freak or Freak Show, thus giving this version of Baby the temporary nickname of Freak Show Baby. Later that month, on the anniversary of FNaF, Scott shared some behind-the-scenes images on its website Scott Games. While this wasn't unusual behavior for the anniversary, what was unusual are sections of models that could be seen hiding behind the main frames of the images. These models looked very similar to characters we already knew of, but were just barely different. Much later in the year, Scott released new teasers on his website that seemed to be advertising the lighthearted Tycoon game he mentioned in the Steam post. And before long, the game was posted to Steam. Nobody seemed to expect what the game actually had in store though. To everyone's surprise, the game Scott released served as both the Pizzeria Tycoon and also the 6th official FNaF game. For the sake of clarity, it's important to keep in mind that Scott later commented that the reasoning for the more inconspicuous release wasn't for the sake of trolling the fanbase. It was actually in response to a comment he saw, which essentially said that if Scott just tries releasing teasers again, it would give people fatigue. And in a way, Scott agreed. But now that we're on to the actual game, I can now lay out the distinct sources of lore in this game. This game, in itself, is broken up into phases, so I feel I'll do the same for the lore sources. The first source we'll discuss is the out-of-game stuff, like menu Easter eggs and the credits, which are moderately important this time around. Then I'll move on to the lore given to us in the Tycoon phase of the game, then the Salvage phase, before finally talking about the lore that can be found in the main night sections of the game. It's worth mentioning that the Salvage phase takes place after the night phase in the actual gameplay, but for reasons that should become obvious, I'll be wanting to talk about the night phase lore last. So moving on to the lore important stuff, let's start with the out-of-game details. Rarely, when starting the game, a scene is shown of a brick alleyway in the rain, with one of the 4 animatronics sitting in it. While most of these scenes don't show us anything vital, the one with Lefty gives us a specific angle that allows us to see familiar black and white stripes poking out of Lefty's shoulder. In the corner of the wall on this screen is a poster of the puppet, and in the credits we get the official names of the voiced characters. But it's worth noting that Scraptrap's real given name is William Afton. Woohoo! This means that we don't need the books to get his official name. He is unique in this way. In the Tycoon phase, we get most of the game's lore drops through 4 distinct machines you can buy for your pizzeria: Candy Cadet, Fruity Maze, Security Puppet, and Midnight Motorist. Midnight Motorist is particularly complicated, so I split it into its own video, which you can watch here. Although people have pointed out great counters to my theory in this video, the fact is, I don't think anyone has figured out this minigame as of writing this video, so I'll be using that explanation when we get to the timeline, albeit putting a red border around it. Starting with Candy Cadet, this guy has a small chance of telling you one of 3 possible stories when you interact with him, all of which hold relevance. To summarize, the first story is about a man who adopts 5 children to keep them safe and brings them all into his home. One night, a burglar breaks in and kills all 5 children. Then the man stitched the 5 bodies together to make 1 child. Later that night, there is a knock at the door. The second story involves a boy who owns a red snake and brings 5 kittens into his house to keep them safe. He's afraid the snake may kill the kittens, but he can't get himself to kill the snake either. The rest of the story is debated due to its semantics, so I'm going to quote it directly from now on. He knew that if he chose 1 kitten to feed the snake, it might be satisfied. But he could not choose, so he went to bed, leaving the cage open. The snake went to the shoebox, chose a kitten at random, and ate it. After 5 nights had gone by, the boy was full of regret and cut the snake open. He pieced the remains together and put the kitten back into the shoebox. The third story involves a woman trapped in a small room with a furnace and 5 keys. She's told she can only bring 1 key with her to bring 1 of 5 children with her to safety. The woman decides to melt all of the keys together to try to save all 5, but in the end it doesn't work and all 5 children are left to die. For years, people have gone by the assumption that all of these stories are recounts of the same incident, just told in different ways. All 3 of them, of course, involving the combining of 5 things into 1 thing, with a relation to death. This, along with a piece of evidence I'll touch on later, seems to contribute to the idea that Afton combined the original 5 animatronics into 1 at some point and did something with them. Again, I'll expand on this idea later. In the meantime, I'd like to bring up a perspective given by ID's fantasy. She believes that in reality, it's only the first story with the man and the orphans that relates to this generally accepted theory, with the other 2 relating to something totally different. Specifically, she believes that the second story, with the kittens, is about how Baby captured Elizabeth and Mike was later tasked with putting her back together. This one I have a little trouble with, as it's hard to tell the intention here. If you read the story literally and keep in mind the real-world science fact that snakes don't need to eat every day, then it reads as if the snake only ever ate 1 kitten, and after 5 nights, the boy is regretful and put the singular kitten back together. At the end of the day, I've realized that whether you believe this story is also about Afton combining the missing children, or you agree with ID on the idea that this is about Elizabeth and Baby, this story ends up being redundant, given the former, as mentioned, is already explained by a prior story, and the latter is outright stated to be the case in Sister Location. Where I think ID really hits the nail on the head though, is her idea that the story about the woman and the keys is also different from what most people think, and is actually about how the puppet had the chance to save 1 of 5 children, but in the end did more harm than good by sealing their souls to the animatronics. Looking at the stories at a higher level, the first 2 are about someone who knows about an active threat. Even still, they bring 5 innocents into their home, and after their eventual death from said threat, combines them into 1. The third story is different, however. On a high level, It's about someone who's already in the same situation as the other 5 innocents, and before something bad happens to them, in an attempt to save all 5, the main character does an action which causes all 5 to stay in that bad situation, when in reality they could have saved at least one of them. This slight differentiation from the other 2 leads me to believe that ID is totally correct in this case. I'm not one to dwell on others' theories for too long, so if you're interested in what her full thoughts were, go watch the original video linked in the description. I personally think it's worth the watch, it's really interesting. Moving on to Fruity Maze, this game is relatively simple. It's a Pac-Man style game, and whenever the screen flashes, you can see the reflection of a girl with blonde hair. The first time you play the minigame, the game is normal and the girl is smiling in the reflection. If you beat the game once, it's never the same again. The first time you play after completing the game, the map is littered with what looks to be like a bloody corpse of a dog or a cat. The third time you play the game, the girl is still frowning in the reflection while Spring Bonnie stares over her shoulder. It's worth mentioning throughout all of these games, yellow rabbits can pop from the ground to stare at you. Anyways, in the third iteration of the game, there is no more fruit. Now there's just an even bloodier dog corpse, flowers, and what is this? A box? Like a dog coffin maybe? Wait, that's not supposed to be the FNaF 4 box, is it? Pushing that mildly concerning thought out of my mind, it's also worth noting that the 10-second warning sound in this version of the game is replaced with the sound of a car alarm. When we inevitably run out of time, presumably the Spring Bonnie says, "He's not really dead. He's over here. Follow me." Strangely, as he speaks, his text color alternates between a yellow and a purple. It can be presumed that what happened here is this girl's pet was hit by a car and died, and William uses her grief to his advantage to lure her away to her death. This minigame is often underrated in the regard that I honestly think this is the most disturbing situation directly presented to us in the entire series of the games. Finally, we have the security puppet. By clicking on it, you can play it as if it were an arcade machine, which takes you to a minigame where your goal is to stop a child wearing a green bracelet. The first 3 times you play this game, the green bracelet child never appears. The 4th time, however, the muted sound of rain can be heard in place of the usual music, as the puppet struggles to escape the box. Outside, a girl wearing a green wristband can be seen before she disappears into the darkness. Finally escaping the box and heading outside, the puppet starts to break down in the rain before it falls down next to the girl's body, with tire tracks being seen in the foreground. This minigame seems to be a retelling of the Save Him minigame from FNaF 2, with this child presumably being locked outside, killed by Afton, and then possessing the puppet. The important thing to distinguish here is this time the child is a girl, not a boy. Moving on to the Salvage Phase now. In this phase, we're tasked with running diagnostics on animatronics reportedly found outside of the pizzeria, and the voice coming from the tape recorder mentions that this specific responsibility is an important section of quote-unquote Paragraph 4 of our special obligation. These animatronics, which we'll touch more on later, are Molten Freddy, Scrap Baby, Scrap Trap, and Lefty. If you ever decide to throw one of them back into the alley, tutorial unit tells us to not forget Saturday, as we'll want them all to be in one place. All of the animatronics except for Lefty have voice lines when you successfully scrap them. Afton and Baby's voice lines are particularly interesting.
What a deceptive calling. I knew it was a lie the moment I heard it, obviously, but it is intriguing nonetheless.
You don't really know who your employer is, do you?
It seems to be implied here that someone has specifically called out to these animatronics to bring them here, who is presenting themselves as an ally to them. While most of them are convinced, William has sniffed it out as being a trick, albeit is still curious what's going on here. Finally, onto the main night segments. There's quite a bit to go through, so I'm going to start with the voice lines. Well, okay, there's a lot of them, so I'll only mention the ones I find important. Starting with Molten Freddy, one of his voice lines is, "Together again." Knowing the context that Molten Freddy was once entered, before Baby was kicked out of it, as shown in the website conversation mentioned earlier, this hints at who we're actually playing as in this game. Michael. You know, since before Baby was kicked out of Ennard, Ennard was kicked out of Michael. William Afton has a line of,
I always come back.
This is a reference to the subtle plot point that William never stays dead. Okay, seriously though, he has other lines that say,
Bittersweet, but fitting.
and
You may not recognize me at first, but I assure you, it's still me.
again adding to the implication that we play as Michael. He has another line which says,
Fascinating. What they have become.
this doesn't really have big lore implications. I just want to call it out because it shows an interesting part of William's character we don't get to see much. His fascination with his own work. Maybe has a line of,
You're not who I expected to see.
which not only adds to the implication we're playing as Michael, but may also serve as a way to further the idea that she thinks she's been employed by someone who's on her side. Finally, it may or may not be worth mentioning that if Lefty ever catches you, you just hear a shushing sound. If you buy the Egg Baby in the Tycoon mode, in the night phase, your computer's power button turns blue. By holding this button down as you turn your computer on, you hear the man from the salvage tapes give a short speech of sorts in a recording labeled HRY 223. The 223 is often thought to mean the recording was made in 2023, and for those who have read the books, we know HRY stands for Henry, the man behind the tapes. We don't use the books in the series though, so we're going to have to stick with the name HRY to stay on brand. As he speaks, 3 blueprints are shown on screen. The first is a blueprint of the scooper from the previous game. What's important here is that it shows that it stores and injects something called remnant. From what the blueprints say, remnant is a substance that needs to be heated to a malleable state, but if overheated, loses its effects. It also loses its effect if there is an overexposure to the substance. The second is labeled Remote Activated Simulated C, where C presumably stands for child. This blueprint just seems to show a rudimentary robot that mimics the temperature of a child, and for some reason needs to stay connected to a server to not risk inaccurate population representation. It's clear this robot is what the lure in the main gameplay actually is. The third blueprint appears to be Lefty. Its blueprint just contributes to the idea that Lefty was designed to capture the puppet, with B implying that Lefty is supposed to mimic the frequency of the child's bracelet from the security puppet minigame, and C implying that the puppet is constantly electrified inside of Lefty, albeit it's not guaranteed it keeps it under control, alongside the lullaby that's being played. It's notable that while the Scooper blueprint has an Afton Robotics signature, the other two have a Fazbear Entertainment signature. In the files, there's a fourth, unused blueprint that's actually said to be a facial recognition file of Molten Freddy. There's no signature on this file, and it really just confirms what we know of Molten Freddy being what's left of Ennard, but also it mentions that whatever this remnant stuff is, Molten Freddy is full of it. I think from the clues we get here, we can put together a reasonable estimate of what remnant is. Obviously it's some type of heated substance, but also remember after being scooped in sister location, Michael somehow survives as a hollowed out, rotten human. But now we know that when he was scooped, he was also injected with this remnant stuff, as were the fun times. Furthermore, you'll find later in the video that the entire goal of this HRY figure is to set all of the animatronics you capture on fire. It specifically mentioned that overheating this remnant stuff neutralizes its effects, so I think we can derive from the context of Michael and sister location and these blueprints that remnant is some type of substance that preserves life somehow, in some way. It keeps Michael alive when he should be dead, and it's likely related to why Molten Freddy is significant to begin with. It's powered by this quote-unquote soul juice, and who's to say that the life within isn't restless? Before I continue this thought, let's hear HRY say what he has to say first.
It's only now that I understand the depth of the depravity of this creature, this monster that I unwillingly helped to create, as if what he had already done wasn't enough. He found a new way to desecrate, to humiliate, to destroy. As if the suffering wasn't enough, the loss of innocence, the loss of everything to so many people. Small souls trapped in prisons of my making, now set to new purpose, and used in ways I never thought imaginable. He lured them all back to a familiar place, back with familiar tricks. He brought them all together. Are they still aware? I hope not. It keeps me awake at night. I could make myself sleep, but not yet. Not until I undo what he has done and heal this wound. A wound first inflicted on me, but then one that I let bleed out to cause all of this. He set some kind of trap. I don't know what it was, but he led them there again. He overpowered them again, and he robbed them of the only thing that they had again. I don't know how those tiny breaths of life came to inhabit those machines, but they will never find rest now, not like this. I have to call them all back, all of them, together in one place.
If it wasn't clear by the visuals I displayed on screen, what I think HRY is talking about here is how his complacency with William and his refusal to let the Fazbear brand die after his child's death only led to more pain and suffering. I realize we haven't gotten to the confirmation yet that the child possessing the puppet is HRY's daughter, but bear with me for now. This seems to give us a pretty solid indication that the puppet was, in fact, the first victim of William's actions, while also implying HRY may not have fully realized William was behind it at first. He mentions that there are small souls in prisons of his making that were set to new purpose. Going back to what I touched on with Remnant just a moment ago, what this leads me and plenty of others to believe is when William is seen destroying the animatronics in FNaF 3, he's turning the parts of them we don't see in FNaF 3's gameplay, namely the endoskeletons, into this Remnant stuff. This Remnant likely resides in Molten Freddy, but may also be the same Remnant inside of Michael and Baby. It's certainly possible William used Remnant on himself too, but given the corpse in the Springlock suit doesn't look exactly animated, it's more likely he's just possessed, like the puppet or Lefty is. The idea that Purple Guy's actions in 3 directly connect to this Remnant creation ties directly into what HRY says after this, being that William lured them back to a familiar place. That familiar place, of course, being the back room they originally got killed in. He then goes on to ask if the souls are still aware, which leads me into another break I want to take from the speech, to discuss my personal interpretation of what Remnant actually is. As I mentioned earlier, I think that Remnant is a heated substance that allows for the preservation of life, but by the same token it requires life or soul to begin with, as an ingredient. I mentioned back in my FNaF 3 video that I feel at that point in time the souls were attached to the costumes and not the endoskeletons. In a way, I feel that's still true. I feel the quote-unquote conscious part of the souls lived in the suits, as the conscious parts of the souls of Elizabeth, William, and HRY's daughter live in Baby, Scraptrap, and the puppet respectively. When turned into Remnant though, the soul is purely used for its properties. The actual conscious part of the spirit is lost in the creation of Remnant. So in other words, while Remnant made from the original spirits may reside in Molten Freddy, they aren't in control, or at least they don't seem to be. They more so act as a battery for the monster that Molten Freddy is. With that all covered, we can let HRY finish his speech. The final parts of his speech seem to just be setting up the plot for this game, the undoing of Afton's wrongdoing. He makes a promise to gather all of the lingering souls together so they can all be put to rest together. This of course leads us to our final bit of lore given to us in the night phase, and the most iconic and memorable part of this entire series, HRY's big reveal. I'm obviously not going to play the entire speech here, but for those who haven't heard it, I urge you to. It is genuinely one of the most breathtaking and satisfying moments in this entire franchise. To summarize the speech, HRY states what I've been pointing out this entire video: the plan to lure, capture, burn, and ultimately release all of the lingering spirits of Afton's crimes, including the man himself, to which he delivers the most metal line I've heard in any game I've played before.
Although for one of you, the darkest pit of hell has opened to swallow you whole, so don't keep the devil waiting, friend.
HRY then goes to add on to the pile of implications that we play as Michael, saying that although a way out was planned for us, as the job wasn't necessarily intended for us, he knows that we're exactly where we want to be, and that he is remaining as well. Wrapping up his speech, he confirms what I've already stated, and that his daughter went on to possess the puppet, and confirms that this is in fact the end for all of them. When transmission cuts off, our screen goes black. We're then treated to one final cutscene, which serves as a stark contrast to the scene we just saw, being a congratulatory message from the tutorial unit. It's eerie in a way to think that this message was prepared for an employee who finished the job as they were supposed to, but canonically, nobody ever got a chance to hear it. What's important about this cutscene, though, it confirms that by now, Fazbear Entertainment is no longer a corporate entity. After the credits, we're treated to one final scene featuring 5 gravestones in the foreground and 1 in the background. 4 of the names are visible, while the 5th is covered with grass. Lining up the 4 main gravestones with the masks in the ending of FNaF 3, we get the names of the missing children: Gabriel, Fritz, Susie, and Jeremy. I can't describe just how impactful this ending was at the time. It's weird to think that the release of FNaF 6 is closer to the release of the first game than it is to the current day. Even still, that final speech, this final game, left an impression on me and many others that really sold this story as something unforgettable. The final comment I want to make before we get to the timeline is, to me, the inclusion of this scene of the gravestones is just more fuel on the fire that the original children were present in some way, be it in Molten Freddy or elsewhere. This means we'll have to change the placement of the happiest day on the timeline to be after FNaF 6, when the souls are truly freed. I feel this is what Scott meant when he later stated that it was complex, which ending of FNaF 3 was canon. At the time of FNaF 3, the bad ending is canon, but come FNaF 6, the happiest day came to be for real. Since I tried a different style in this video, in explaining details as they come up rather than synthesizing everything near the end, that means we can head straight onto the timeline. A lot of the details in this game are simply added information on things we already know. For example, I'm just putting Susie's story onto the MCI tile as an add-on of sorts. Also keep in mind, I'm going to be using the color purple to signify events we learn of in this game. First, let's place down Midnight Motorist. Obviously, this would have to be concurrent with FNaF 4's gameplay, given what I claim in my Midnight Motorist video. I'm going to go out on a limb and say this happened sometime before William's demise. Again though, these events get a red border, since I'm not certain that this is their true placement. Between his death and the dismantling of the animatronics, we can place down William's creation of Remnant. You may have to suspend your disbelief a little bit for this, and make the assumption that FNaF 3's minigames don't all happen on the same night, but I feel that works well enough. Moving on, likely following Ennard's ejection from Michael, the robots split up into Molten Freddy and Baby. Passing up FNaF 3, we can place the concoction of HRY's master plan. Again, the recording date seems to be dated for 2023, so this may line up well. You could even interpret the burning of Fazbear's Fright as being HRY's aha moment of what he needed to do to finish things. This is of course just speculation. Anyways, likely concurrent with this, he builds Lefty to go search for and capture the puppet for him. Shortly after, HRY sets up the FNaF 6 pizzeria, and Mike takes the job offer. He also sets a lure for the 4 targets, which over the week Mike collects and stores in the pizzeria. Then we get to Saturday, the day HRY's plan truly comes to light, with the souls freed and William damned to eternal punishment. And with this, we can place our final event on the timeline, the freeing of the souls, the happiest day. And just to throw it out there, look at the shape of this building. Look familiar? What if I pointed out the fact that here, the pieces were all put together, all in one place? Congratulations, the timeline as of this game is complete. However, our job isn't finished just yet. If you recall a couple of comments I made in my FNaF 3 video, you may remember 2 distinct observations. Firstly, on FNaF 3's Night 5 minigame, the 5th soul is already free from its suit. If my endoskeleton interpretation is true, this implies that William removed Golden Freddy's endoskeleton long ago, for whatever reason. Some may speculate that it's because the crying child's spirit was also in the endoskeleton, but I'm not going to go there right now. What's important is, this idea is supported by Golden Freddy's appearance throughout the entire series. Even if you want to make the assertion that Golden Freddy is simply a spring-lock suit that's in suit mode, isn't it weird that after so long, even after refurbishment between FNaF 1 and 2, the Golden Freddy suit's spring locks supposedly hold firm in suit mode? I propose because it isn't just because it's been put into suit mode. The endoskeleton components have been fully ripped out of Golden Freddy, It may have even been William's first test on a remnant. That aside, remember the other comment I made offhandedly in that video. Video clip begins in 3, 2, 1. A tangible golden Freddy suit is not seen in this location. Even if the other costume suits were burned in FNaF 3, there is one that was left behind. If my interpretation is correct, and that the conscious parts of the souls light in the suits, that means there's still one loose end remaining. One soul that was left behind. One soul that would still hold on tight no matter how much fire you'd use on it. And in the next, and likely final episode of the series, we'll cover just that. End communication. Subscribe to Crazy Samurai.